No, really, God is speaking to us. And Pastors Lynn and Carmen, God is speaking to you. There is something in this generation now that the Lord is wanting to whisper again to his people to tell us, this is the hour. This is the time, this is the hour, this is where we have to take our focus off of ourselves, and we have to look out again into what God has called all of us to be a part of. And how exciting it is, though. What we're hearing is it's exciting. It's exciting. And God's opening doors, giving us breakthroughs, giving us buildings, giving us things, giving us cities, giving us nations. He's opening doors. Well, if you have your Bibles, or they can put it on the screen, I would like to look at Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 2. Isaiah 54 and verse 2, which tells us this. Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch out the curtains of your dwellings and spare not. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your pegs. Now, usually, and I've heard this scripture over and over and over through the years because I've been around the church. I won't say how many years, but a lot of years. And since I was 7 years old. And so I've been around the church, and every time I've ever heard someone teach this scripture, they always taught it this way. It was always when the church needed to go into a building program and enlarge the church a little bit. And so it was right before they were going to get everyone in the church to pledge a little bit of their dollars to build the church a little bit larger, because they needed it because they were growing. And they said, thus says the Lord, enlarge the place of your tent and stretch out the curtains of your dwellings and spare not. So in other words, all you businessmen, spare not, cough it up, get ready for it, because it's time to build a new church. And that's often what we think about, and that's great. That's actually, well used. But as I thought about it, I thought, my mind always goes in a little bit different direction. And as I thought about it, I thought, no, first of all, what is a tent? What is a tent? If he says enlarge your tent, what is a tent? And of course, he's talking to people in that time in the Middle East and that often lived in this. But what is a tent? A tent is a covering, a shelter, that which keeps you from the rain, the storms. It's that place of covering and protection. It's where you would dwell. It would keep you from the weather, keep you, of course, from the harsh sun. But there was something very different when you spoke of a tent to people living in the Middle East. Because according to Middle East tradition, once someone was under your tent, you were completely responsible to take care of them. That means every need, every aspect of their well-being. That, of course, included you had to feed them, you had to clothe them, but you also had to bring them under your protection. In other words, you might have to lay your life down for them if they were brought into your house. Now, a classic example of this, now, not that you've all seen this movie, but there was a movie out called Lone Survivor. And if any of you remember that movie, this Navy SEAL or Special Forces, he goes up, everyone in his units dies. He alone survives barely. Boy, when you see what he goes through, you're just hurting the whole time. He barely survives, but a villager takes him in, and then it was, I don't know, Al-Qaeda or one of them, they're trying to come in and get a hold of him. But this man in a village says, no, they've come under my covering. They've come under my protection. And this man's willing to lay his life down for this stranger that is broken and beaten and torn apart and about dead anyway. He's willing to put his family at jeopardy to bring this one in because he's brought him under his protection. And so I began to understand a little bit more of what they were talking about here. And then I remembered the Bible story of, how many remember the Bible story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the nephew of Abraham, Lot? Remember, I used to think about Lot because Lot, remember, had the strangers coming into his house, which were angels, but the men of the city were so wicked, they wanted those men, so they come to Lot's door, and Lot says, don't bother these men because they've come under my protection. And he said, you can have my 2 daughters instead. And I always thought when I read that scripture, I thought, what a creep. I'd like to knock him upside the head. What do you mean you're going to give your 2 daughters up? But not realizing how clear it was to that culture, that time, and throughout history, that when someone came under your roof, you were completely responsible for them. You fed them, you clothed them, you'd lay your life down for them if they were under your roof. And then I began to realize a little bit more then of what this is talking about. So now let's look what he says. Enlarge your tent, expand the measure of your covering, your protection, your provision. See, the current extent of your church is only as far as the responsibilities, the covering, and the protection, provision you give. That's as far as it goes. That's how large your church is. And I'm not talking about numbers. How far is your reach? I'm not talking about how many people in your church, but how far is your reach? Who do you extend to? See, some people, their tent is very, 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 very small, and they like it that way. They like a little small tent. They like to just have their little, I got my own little pup tent here. I got my little tent. If it's raining out, I'm covered in my little tent. I can pull out my little Coleman stove and I can make myself a little bit of food. I can have something to eat and I don't need anybody. I got my tent. I'm covered. All my needs are met. Other people, their tent is their family. Praise God. And they cover their family. That man or woman of God knows I'm responsible to take care of and cover my family, cover those under my tent. But then there's others. They stretch their tent out far beyond to people they don't know, people they didn't watch grow up, people they didn't maybe care about before, but something inside of them says, no, I'm going to cover them as well. I'm going to bring them under my covering. My tent is going to stretch out a little bit further, a little bit more, a little bit more. And so my question for you, church, today is simply this. How far will you go for a soul? How far will you stretch your tent in this life? Will you spend your whole life under your little pup tent enjoying your life until you die? Or will your tent stretch out just a little bit further? How far will you go? And you got to understand something. When he says, stretch out your tent and spare not, how many know what that means? It means work. It wasn't easy. It doesn't mean this is going to be simple. It's a whole lot simpler just to stay under your little pup tent. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to pay any more money. You're covered. You did good. You're covered. No, to stretch out your tent means work, means expense, means effort. Something's got to happen there. So now I started thinking a little bit about this, and I thought, well, how far would people really go to reach someone else? How far? What would they do? And so the first story that came to mind was, of course, when Jesus went to Samaria. Now, those of you that know a little bit about Bible history and the cultures and what was going on at the times, you find in this story that when Jesus went to Samaria, he wasn't going to a comfortable place for him as of course, a Jewish rabbi at that time. See, what you find in the story is that the Jews had nothing to do with the Samaritans. I think that's why Jesus used stories like the Good Samaritan. That's exactly why. He used stories. He just wanted to stir them up a little bit because the truth is the Jewish people hated Samaritans. They hated them worse than the Romans. They hated them worse than anybody. And the reason why is this. To the Jewish people, though they didn't like the Romans were just awful pagans that didn't know any better. But the Samaritans, they were once part of the tribes of Israel. They were the ones that were of the 10 tribes. Remember, there's 12 tribes, but 10 tribes broke off, and those 10 tribes that broke off, they intermarried with the pagan people of the land. They worshiped their gods. They followed their things. And so to the Jewish mind, these people were lower than anything imaginable. See, to the Jewish mind, this was like This would be like for us, say, for example, a Christian who served the Lord for years and years and years, enjoyed the fellowship, enjoyed the worship, enjoyed the times together, and then all of a sudden said, I think I'm going to go and be a witch. That's about what the equivalent was. We would go, oh my goodness, how could you experience the things of God and then go back? Well, that's what the Jews thought about the Samaritans. So they hated them. They wouldn't touch them. They wouldn't go near them. And all of a sudden we find in John chapter 4, Jesus purposely goes to Samaria. Because you didn't just go there on accident. You had to purposely go there. You didn't just like walk through it. You purposely made your way to Samaria. So we find this story, John chapter 4. Now, of course, you know, if you know anything about the story, you remember this is the story where Jesus encounters that woman that had 5 husbands. Miss Hollywood. She had 5 husbands. And the one she's with now was not her husband. Of course, this is the story where Jesus sends the disciples into town to buy food while he waits at a well before that woman came. And so before she comes, remember, he's just there, he's thirsty, it's in the middle of the day, and a woman comes to the well in the middle of the day. Now, another thing, if you know anything about church, culture in that time, women didn't come to a well in the middle of the day. You came to the well in the morning, you came to have water for the day, then you came to the well in the evening to have water for the evening meals and all the needs that were there. You don't go to the well in the middle of the day. For one, it's hot. You don't go there. But then we begin to get a little bit of insight. And you say, well, why did she come in the middle of the day? And you realize, well, maybe she came in the middle of the day because in a Middle Eastern culture, and she was the one who had 5 husbands, the other women probably talked a lot about her if she came in the morning or she came in the evening when the other women came. So she came when no one's around. Comes up to the well, and this man starts to talk to her. She recognizes maybe she sees that he's a rabbi, or she just understands he's a Jewish man, maybe by the way he's dressed. And she says, why are you talking to me? You people have no dealings with us. You people won't talk to us. You people won't touch us. Remember, too, in the story, the disciples come back, and even the disciples look around. They don't say anything to Jesus, but they say amongst one another, they say, why is he talking to her? Why would Jesus talk to that woman? My goodness, what's wrong with him? Now, and they don't know the story, the other part of the story yet, though. They don't know she's had 5 husbands, and the one she's with now is not her husband. But Jesus talked to her. Jesus asked her for a drink. First, Jesus is violating all kinds of Jewish traditions, especially for a rabbi. Talking to a foreigner, talking to a woman, and then actually touching her if he was to take a drink from her. He'd be ceremonially unclean. But Jesus went. What kind of woman was this? Now here's what you don't know. In the Middle East, a woman had no choice to divorce her husband, let alone 5 husbands. If a woman tried to divorce one, they probably would have taken her out and killed her. That was the times. They'd take her out and kill her. So then you mean to tell me she did this 5 times and survived? She had no choice in the matter. In their day, remember those men, especially because of wars, many men would die, but sometimes those men would come along, they'd have multiple wives. They were polygamous, they'd have more than one wife. A man would never just divorce his wife, usually, except for this reason. His wife could not have children. She was barren. Because a man in those days, even if he didn't like his wife so much after a while and he wanted a new, younger version. We lived in Indonesia, and there's a law there. You can have 4 wives. If you get tired of those, you can get 4 more. If you get tired of those, you can get 4 more. But you are limited 12 a lifetime. And so you always see these guys with their wife, and so then they have the younger version. And so this is the thing. Even in Middle Eastern days, they would have said, if that woman had children, well, that's the mother of my children. I may get another wife, but that's the mother of my children. And she stays. 99.9% of heavy scholars believe the reason this woman had 5 husbands was purely because she couldn't have children. So now you see her in a little bit different light. Imagine this. Imagine how broken she was. That 5 times someone said to her, I take you under my covering, and I will love you till death do us part. I will bring you into my home. I will take care of you. And then 5 times they threw her away. Now the women don't like her, and they talk about her. Now she's with a man that won't even marry her, and they most say probably just for the protection she had this man in her home. So she may not have been the type of woman that most people and most pastors preach about her and tell you that what she was or what she did. She might have been an absolutely broken woman that in that culture 5 times was thrown away because she didn't meet the expectation of the one who took her in. And then Jesus comes along on purpose. The disciples wonder, why is he doing this? Why would he talk to her? Remember now, the disciples came and the disciples were sent to the town to buy food, and they come back and they say, hey, Jesus, look at this. Hey, Jesus, we got the food you told us to get you. We stopped at Arby's, we stopped at KFC, we stopped at McDonald's too. We got a whole choice. What do you want? And what did Jesus say? Oh, this ought to hit you. I have food to eat that you know nothing about. And the smart disciples at the time go, who gave him some food? Who was sneaking Jesus food that we didn't know about? You hear what Jesus said? You better get this, church. What he said was, that which drives me. Let me tell you something. You all know, when you're really hungry, you're not thinking about anything else, are you? But I need some food, and I need some food right now. Where is it? I'm drawn to it. I can't think of anything else. And when you see all the things, you're just ready to turn in wherever, even if it's not what you like right then, but it's food, and you're hungry, and you want something right now. Especially if you're hungry and somebody's got the barbecue going. If you don't like that neighbor, you're still willing to go over and say, hey, how's it going? Because something is drawing you. Now look you know what it's like when you're hungry? And Jesus said, that which satisfies me, that which does it for me, the food that I have you know nothing about, is when one broken, lonely, thrown away woman that no one wanted anything to do with. We see this even more clearly because remember when she went back to the city, it says she went back and told the men. She didn't tell the women. The women wouldn't receive her. She went back and told the men, come and see this man. Told me everything. Jesus said, my food is for one broken, lonely soul. That's what feeds me. What feeds you? What does it for you? What satisfies you? Remember what Jesus said when he started his ministry. Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. Why? Because I'm God. No, he said the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom to those prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Of course, you know Acts 10:38, you know Jesus of Nazareth, how he went around doing good. Hell, he was anointed by the Holy Spirit, and he healed all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. That was his life. That's why he came. That's what he did. What do you do? I say that to everybody. I say it to me. What do I do? Let me tell you my story just a little bit. Most people think when they meet me, not that I mean anything, but they think, oh, you must have come from some specially groomed ministry background and family and this and that. And they think that. They think, oh, you've just grown up in the church. And I actually did kind of grow up in the church, but the way I came into church, very different. Nobody brought me to church. Nobody invited me to church. My parents were getting divorced, and it was very, very, very bad, ugly divorce. When my mother ran off with a truck driver, and my father married a bottle of Jim Beam. Sounds like a country song, right? He did. He just started drinking, and he never let it. He was so depressed, he never let it run dry. And so I went with my father. My mother was on the road with the truck driver. And my father, because he was so depressed, I'm 7 years old, my father would rent a place, wouldn't pay the rent again, they'd kick us out. He'd rent another place, wouldn't pay again, they'd kick us out. We just kept going through. So I moved about 20 times as a kid. But here was the fun thing. Just before they were divorced, and I was so depressed, I'd run away from home a number of times. I'd get down the road, and then I'd get hungry, and I'd go back home. Realize I had no place to go. But what stood out to me, there was a church across the street from where we lived. It's a little church. And I noticed that on Wednesday nights, and on Sunday morning, the children my age would get out of the cars, and they were always running around the grass in front of the church, playing and having fun. And I looked over there week after week, and I said, how come they're so happy and I'm so sad? Those kids are always happy, and I'm so sad. So one day, just again before the divorce, I said to my mom, I said, can I go over there? And my mother said, okay, you can go. But if you go over there, you have to dress nice, because they won't let you in unless you dress nice. So she goes, I'll make sure you look good. So she did. She made sure I dressed nice. I went over there first Sunday. I don't know anything about the church. I know nothing. I walk in Sunday. They take me to the Sunday school class. Immediately, one of the Sunday school teachers says, her name was Mrs. Ballin. She says, is there anyone here that doesn't know Jesus and doesn't know if you're going to heaven? I raised my hand. And when I raised my hand, all the other children laughed at me, which isn't very nice to do in church. They laughed at me. Well, after the Sunday school lesson in class, the Sunday school teacher pulls me aside, Mrs. Ballin. She says, hey, I noticed you raised your hand when I asked if anyone didn't know Jesus. And I said, well, I don't. And she says, can I talk to you? And she took me inside a room and spent about 45 minutes talking to me, going through, a little track about a little boy who had sinned. And I don't know, he stole some cookies or something. But he lied and he sinned. But Jesus paid the price even for him. But anyway, she told me this story, and then she said, do you want to receive Jesus? And I said, yeah, sure, okay. So she prayed a little prayer with me, and guess what happened? It worked. At 7 years old, and it worked. Immediately, I felt Jesus. I felt him. I was 7 years old. I became a little evangelist after that. I went around telling everybody about Jesus. I was 7 years old. But here's the thing. Remember where I was living? I tell people, because I was living with my father, and who would take me from place to place to place. We'd move and move and move. I tell people, I can't say this as a pastor. You might get upset at me. I've been in more bars than any of you. Because my dad would literally take me from bar to bar to bar. I learned how to play pool really well because he would just toss me quarters, go play another game, and I'd play against myself. I played the first video game. It was called Pong. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Pong, but it's just a little kind of blank TV screen, and you had this little thing, and you tick, and you played tennis kind of against yourself. Boom, the little thing goes over, and I played against myself, so it was tick, tick. That was my life. Now, here's the problem. Growing up that way, I saw the worst of society. We always lived in the worst places in town. The only place that would kind of let my dad in with me and his limited resources. But here's what happened. The friend of Mrs. Ballin, who led me to the Lord, was an 80-year-old woman by the name of Mrs. Middleton, around that. Mrs. Middleton, and Mrs. Middleton never said anything to me, never really talked to me. But when I was a little boy, she did say, I heard you accepted Jesus. And I said, yes? And she said, well, I got the information from Mrs. Ballin, and I'd like to give you this. And she gave me a beautiful new King James Bible with my name written on the front. I'm a little boy. Now, I got that Bible, and the King James, I just couldn't get that whole. I couldn't read that. Yea, even verily thou shalt go therefore hither and thither. And I didn't quite understand all that. But it was a Bible. And so it was holy, and I'd sleep with that Bible. I put the Bible under my pillow, and again, I'd try to read, but I didn't get it. But I kept that Bible because it meant something to me. But as I grew, Mrs. Middleton would drive her old car. It was an old white, and those you younger ones here would never have heard of this kind of car, but a few older ones you might. She drove her old white Rambler. And in her Rambler, she'd come to pick me up and take little Jerry Stott with raggedy clothes, cheap stuff from the worst side of town. But every Sunday, Mrs. Middleton would come and pick me up and drive this little boy to church. A little boy that didn't have any hope. A little boy that didn't have any future. He's going to be just like his dad. He's going to be just living just like that. He's going to be right there. That's the little boy, because I can see it all over. He's not from the good side of town. He's not from the right family. He'll never have a hope, and he'll never have a future. But Mrs. Middleton didn't get that memo. So she kept coming in her little Rambler every Sunday. She wouldn't talk to me. She just let me in, and she'd drive me to church. At one point, I think we lived over 20-some miles away from the church, but still, Mrs. Middleton would come and pick this little boy and drive him to church. What did she see? Every time there was a church camp, Mrs. Middleton paid little Jerry Stott's way to church camp. Every time there was a church skate party, bowling thing, or whatever was going on, Mrs. Middleton paid for little Jerry Stott to go to bowling or ice skating or whatever kind of thing they had going on. Why? Finally, when I was 13, Mrs. Middleton stopped. And that was because they didn't give her another driver. They didn't renew her driver's license, and they wouldn't let her drive anymore. And I didn't go, and I wasn't going to church as much after that. Not until I was 16 and was invited to the Foursquare Church. But here's the thing, at 16 as well, God spoke to me as if audibly. And he told me for a month every day, I heard it in my inside, read that Bible that Mrs. Middleton gave you. Read that Bible, read that Bible. And one day I flipped open that Bible. I just finally said, okay, I'll do it. Flipped open that Bible, and I cried my eyes out for 2 hours, and that's when I knew the Lord had called me. He called me. He called me to be a pastor. That's when I decided I knew I was to be a pastor. Later on, of course, went to Bible college and all the other things. But it was because of Mrs. Middleton. Who would do that? I mean, come on, church. You're going to go out of your way week after week after week after week for some little boy on the bad side of town that nobody else cares about? Who would do that? And I wonder sometimes, if Mrs. Middleton knows, I don't know if she can see that from heaven or not and see this, but does she know then now that the little boy that she invested in, that either directly or indirectly has seen over 1 million souls come to Jesus? Does she know? Does Mrs. Middleton know? Does she know? I know one day, if she doesn't know now, she will know. Because that's the first person I have to give the biggest hug to in heaven. You see, how far will we go for a soul? How far? You know, Let me tell you what, Pastor, when you talked about the Moravian missionaries yesterday, these first two guys that went out, imagine this. The year 1732, and the island of St. Thomas is a slave island. The only people there are slaves and slave masters. And these two young men say they're going to die without somebody bringing them the gospel. So they sell themselves as slaves in order that these slaves would hear the gospel. They sell themselves. They don't, oh, Lord, we just pray one slave will get saved and tell the rest. No, they sell themselves as slaves. But as the story goes on, and there's a lot of stories, later on, 30,000 slaves were baptized. See, and I think about that. How far would you go? What kind of crowns do those guys have in heaven that last eternity? You know, when I think of real missionaries, I have to tell you something. I have to stop for a moment, because they call me, people look at me and they think, ooh, Jerry's this great missionary. Jerry's this great missionary. Jerry and Julie, they're great missionaries. And the problem is I know too much church history, and I go, I stink as a missionary. Really. And this is the reason why. When I think of a real missionary, I think of the Apostle Paul. What was the crown for him? Shipwrecked, broken, stoned, left for dead, starving. You know, I've been beaten by the Jews with these 39 lashes 5 times, the same beating Jesus took. That's a missionary. Because the missionaries I read about, you know where I serve? Or we serve on the ends of the earth in the South Pacific? Almost all of those islands before the missionaries came were cannibal-filled islands. They would eat you. And when these white men came that they had never seen before in most of these islands, they were dinner right away. Now I want you to imagine something though. They traveled from Europe, so say they traveled from England or the Netherlands or wherever. They had to travel all the way down. There was no Panama canals, there was no anything. So they were on ships for months and months and months to come to an island dreaming, we're going to tell these people about Jesus. Some people say half of them died on the ship before they even got there. And then when they arrived at whatever place they were going to, we're going to win these people to Jesus, they were usually killed and eaten within 30 minutes of their arrival. That's a missionary. They laid their lives down in the hopes that someone would hear about Jesus. Now, the reason I'm ashamed of I'm ashamed of myself. I really am. Because I'm terrible. I am terrible. I'm confessing, Pastor. You got to help me out and pray for me afterwards. I'm confessing. I'm terrible as a missionary. Why? Because I just get on a plane and fly over there. And when I get on the plane to fly over there, because I have flown a bazillion miles now, if I get on that plane and they don't recognize who I am and go, Dr. Stott, can we give you a little better seat? And if they put me in a middle seat somewhere and something, I'm like, don't they know what I'm doing? I'm going to do a work for God, and they would dare put me in that middle seat in the back of that plane? Are you kidding me? Don't they? Let me call up the. No, I'm terrible. And then when I arrive someplace, I get there. Nobody wants to eat me. Usually, this is the truth. Usually, when I arrive on an island, they have a little band out there singing songs. They come and they put a flowered lei around my neck, and they hand me a coconut drink, and they take me to the 4 or 5-star hotel in Fiji. I don't do this. That's what they do for me. And I call myself a missionary? I didn't lay my life down for those souls. Somebody else did. Somebody else went long before me and laid their lives down for those souls. How far would you go? What would you do? Oh, I know it's getting real quiet in this Presbyterian church right now. Let me tell you one last story. In the earlier part of the 20th century, there was a missionary couple by the name of David and Sevilla Flood. David and Sevilla Flood had a little 2-year-old boy, and they decided to go to what was called at that time the Belgian Congo. They arrived there with a dream of winning people to Jesus. When they arrived, they made it to their organization's mission station. They get to the mission station, and as they arrive at the mission station, they meet another couple that we only know of as the Ericsons, also from a Scandinavian couple. They meet them, and they begin to talk again, and they had missions work to do there by the mission stations, but something grabbed hold of their hearts. These two young couples said, no, let's go to somewhere where no one has gone before. Star Trek. Let's go where no one's gone before. Let's go to a village that no one has ever reached. And so they identify a village that no one has reached, and they said, let's go in faith. God has given us the village. So they go to the village. Immediately when they arrive, the chief meets them and says, what are you doing here? And they said, we're here to tell you about Jesus. We're here to tell your people about Jesus. The chief says, you're not doing any of that here. He says, if you talk to our people about your God, our gods will be angry. I forbid you. Well, it didn't stop them, though. They said, that's all right. We just need to pray more. So the two couples, they went up on the mountain above the village, and they purposely went up on the mountain. They built little mud houses, and they said, let's be above the village so we can continually see the village and pray for it till God gives the breakthrough. No breakthrough came. Finally, the chief felt sorry for them, and he at least went, those people at least need to eat. So he took one of the little boys in the village, and he sent him up twice a week to the missionary couples, and he gave them chickens and eggs so they at least had some protein in their diet. So twice a week, little boy came up to bring the chickens and the eggs. Well, Sevilla Flood finally started saying, hey, if we can't go to any of the Africans, but one little African boy is coming here, let's reach him. And so every day, or twice a week, whenever the little boy came up, Sevilla said, I'm going to teach this little boy a Bible story. She told him another story, told him another story, told him another story. Every time the little boy came up with the chickens and the eggs. Well, the good news is the little boy gave his life to Jesus. Little boy, just a little boy bringing chickens and eggs to the missionaries. The problem was the conditions were so difficult that both couples were going through malaria continually. Finally, the Ericsons, the other couple, decided, we're done. This is just too hard. It's too harsh. And they went back to the main mission station, but not David and Sevilla. David and Sevilla said, no, we're sticking it out. God is going to give us that village one way or another. God is going to bring a breakthrough to us, and we're going to see that village come to Jesus. Still nothing happened. The boy kept coming. She kept teaching him over and over and over again. And then right in the middle of all this and continual malaria and sickness, Sevilla finds herself pregnant. Again, the chief feels sorry for him. When it comes time to give birth, the chief at least sent a midwife up to help her deliver the baby. A little baby is born. They name her Aina. 17 days later, Sevilla dies. The childbirth was too much for her. The malaria, all the strength was out of her body. At 27 years old, Sevilla Flood dies. David, her husband, goes crazy. He loses the plot, as you'd say. He's enraged. God, I came to bring your love and kindness to these people, and look what you did to me, God. He shook his fist at God. You killed my wife. You've taken everything from us. I will not serve you any longer. David grabbed the little baby girl and their little 2-year-old boy, took him down the mountain to the mission station. He found that at the mission station, his friends, the Ericsons, were still there. He gave the Ericsons the new baby girl and said, I can't take care of this baby. God has taken everything from me, and there's no way I can take care of a newborn baby as well. The Ericsons adopted the baby, took the baby in, but within 8 months, the Ericsons died as well. within weeks apart of each other, strange sickness, and they died on the mission field. The little girl, Amy, was given to then some American missionaries who adopted her. Later, they took her home, brought her back to America. I believe it was Minnesota. They never went back on the mission field because they felt that if they took her back, something could happen and someone could try to take the little girl away from them. So they kept her here. They raised her in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, changed her name to Aggie. Aggie then married a man named Dewey Hurst, a young man in Bible college. They both served the Lord together. Dewey then ends up becoming the principal of a Bible college in Seattle. They worked and served the Lord together. David, her father, had went back, of course, her biological father, back to Sweden, remarried, had four more children, three boys and one girl. So you wonder what happened with the story. Well, then one day, Aggie gets in her mail a Christian magazine. The problem is that there were some Scandinavian people living in the area, I guess, and she gets this magazine in that language, and she doesn't know what it says, but she can tell it's a Christian magazine. So she doesn't understand the language, but she starts flipping through the pages. Now, Aggie had been told the story of her parents, David and Sevilla Flood. She knew the story. She knew what they were. She knew where she came from. And as she's flipping through the magazine, all of a sudden her heart stops because she looks at a picture and she sees a very crude, broken cross at a very crudely built grave, but on the cross it says Sevilla Flood. And she goes, "That's my mother. That's my mother. What does this mean?" She grabs the magazine. She goes down to the Bible college because she knew someone there who could translate it for her that knew the language. And she takes it and she goes, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? She hands him the magazine and he's trying to read quickly and he's looking through it and it says, well, what it tells about is it's telling about a missionary couple by the name of David and Sevilla Flood who went to Africa. And she goes, "That's my mom and dad. That's my parents. Those are my parents. What does it say?" And it says, well, it's telling about how they tried to reach out to the people, but no one would receive them. But finally it says there was a little boy who came and would bring them twice a week chickens and eggs, and your mother would tell him the gospel story. Then he goes on and it says, it tells about how Sevilla Flood had a baby girl. And she goes, that's me. That's me. And then it tells how Sevilla died just days later. The story, though, went on. And then it tells this. It says, but though the missionaries left, the little boy who brought them the chickens and the eggs, who received Jesus, when he grew, he started a school for his village, and he told all the children in his village about Jesus, and soon every child in his village came to Jesus. But it didn't stop there. Then all the children told their parents about Jesus and told the stories that Sevilla Flood had told him, and all the parents came to Jesus. And then as the story went on, and it said, so now today, Sevilla Flood is the most famous person in our village history, because in our village, everyone is a Christian. All 600 in the village is a Christian. Because of one. But the story still didn't end. I know our time's gone, but the story still didn't end. Aggie and her husband were later invited, just 2 years after this, they were invited to go to England for a kind of a missions conference type thing. They get at the conference and they have different speakers, but the key speaker was up sharing, this powerful man, and he was a man who leads 110,000 people. And she happened to hear where he was from, and she said, well, that's where my parents served as missionaries. So, of course, after this dynamic speaker, powerful man, again, leading 110,000 people, she comes up to meet him and says, hello, sir. I heard your message. I just wanted to meet you because I noticed that you're from this part of Africa that my parents were once missionaries at. And so he said, well, who were your parents? She says, well, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but my parents were David and Sevilla Flood. Have you ever heard of them? And the man says, well, yes, of course I have. Sevilla Flood, your mother, is the most famous person where I come from. And it was Sevilla, your mother, who led me to Jesus. You see, when I was a little boy, twice a week I used to take your mother and father and the other missionaries chickens and eggs. And every time I came, your mother would tell me a Bible story. And she led me to Jesus. Now I lead the movement in my nation. How far would you go? Church? It's a soul. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know. How many little boys and little girls are out there that might not ever have a chance? Yeah, as I told you, Mrs. Middleton, she actually didn't even tell me about Jesus. She didn't talk. I'd get in the car, she'd drive me to church. She didn't say anything. But what she did for me changed my life. She didn't have to be an evangelist. She didn't have to say, oh, let me give you the 4 spiritual laws and tell you all about Pentecost. She didn't have to do anything. She's loved me, cared for me. How far will you go? I want to ask if you'd stand with me for a moment. I'm finished.